Assalamualaikum everyone, and welcome back to the second half of day 3 on the Digital Investment Week right here at the Malaysia Tech Month 2021. Join us as I welcome the next session entitled Reshaping the Rules of Global Capitalism. Moderating this session is our very own Raymond Siva, the Senior Vice President for Investment and Brand and Chief Marketing Officer of Malaysia Digital Economy Corporation, or MDEC. Over to you, Raymond.
Thank you, and it's good to be back right after lunch. I hope you guys had a good lunch. This session is going to be really interesting. I have with me someone of global stature, a giant in the area of innovation, disruption, tech, sustainability. And I'm really happy to have him here together with us. It is my pleasure to invite Mr. Chandran Nair, who is the founder of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, or GIFT, to be here with us here today all the way from Hong Kong. Welcome, Chandran. Very quickly, Chandran is proudly Malaysian and a member of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council for Sustainability, a respected best-selling author, and an accomplished saxophonist. This is what I picked up, right? And above all, he's an innovator, disruptor of things as usual. And he once famously said at a TEDx a speech that he gave that we're not on a digital divide. In fact, we're on digital crack. Yeah, we're addicted to digital, right? And on that note, it is my pleasure to give you the floor. Chandran, all yours.
Raymond, thank you so much. I feel bad that I can't be in KL, but I've been stranded in Hong Kong since I got back from KL in April, and I can't go back, but I hope to be back in Malaysia and KL in September. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope you're all well, your families are all well under these very difficult times. So I've been asked to say a few words. I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we can get into an exciting conversation, I hope. So I've been asked to speak about the reshaping the rules of global capitalism. Some of you might say, hey, I thought I signed up for a tech conference. What's this guy doing here? Well, I hope that when I finish in about 40 minutes and then with the Q&A, you will all be asking for another hour or so. But let me start by this. And Raymond talked about, and I'm sure all of you during this conference have heard a lot about, what do you call the word for disabling the current orthodoxy, etc. And so one of the things I'm going to try and do is to disturb you in terms of thinking about things very differently. So, and that's a provocation that I think is necessary in the world we live in. So why is it that we need to talk about the reshaping the rules of global capitalism, right? Disruption is often seen as a tech thing, but we have very little disruption of the way we think about the way the world works. So I'm going to try and provide a bit of disruption in terms of your conception of how the world works, etc. And this is a good time to do it. So I don't need to tell most of you, any of you, in fact, that the world is in very, very troubled waters. We have the pandemic, but that's not the only thing. We have climate change on a massive scale. Even Siberia is burning. We have massive amount of biodiversity loss, and particularly those of us in Southeast Asia, we should know what that looks like. Our biodiversity loss didn't start last year. It's been 20 years. It's called the haze, right? And then we have pollution on a massive scale. One form of it that's ubiquitous is, of course, plastics. So we're in a very troubled spot. Now, the question, of course, is how does technology, and in this particular instance, of course, we're referring to digital technology. And I'm also, very anxious that the world has essentially distilled the word technology to digital. I would argue that probably the most important technologies going forward is actually essentially going to be toilets and water supply. But that's a different discussion. Raymond, you can have me on for next year to talk about that, why we need toilets and water supply before fiber optics. But that's a different discussion. But the root cause of what we have today is our economic model. And then you might say, well, what's that got to do with tech? Well, tech is digital technology is the big enabler of capitalism at the moment. You're probably going to hear lots of speakers who are going to simply talk about how powerful a tool our innovations in technology, digital technology are in allowing to us to essentially go down the same old path of economic growth as we see it, etc. And I'm going to argue that we need to essentially shift our focus. And this is why. I've already given you a sense of the dilemmas that we face in terms of our inability to comprehend the existential threats that the world faces. Most of us are in denial. And so I'm going to try and ask you to say, so what's the purpose of all this digital technology? The most advanced creations of the human mind, what are they actually doing? So the fundamental question to ask is, why do we have economic growth, and why is tech an enabler, whether you call it capitalism or whatever? But capitalism is essentially an ideological term on how do we organize our societies so that we create some kind of prosperity, so that people can essentially utilize resources, services in a way that allows societies to essentially thrive, and thrive in different ways. So that's essentially the question we have to ask. The role of all kinds of innovations is essentially to enable our societies to essentially get organized in ways. And we all, I think, would fundamentally agree that it has to be more equitable, etc. The challenge that we face today is that the form of capitalism that we've all embraced is essentially one that has created a world that is out of sync with the natural order of things. The pandemic is just a little signal of that being disconnected from that. I hope I don't need to spell it out to you, but essentially a form of capitalism, a form of essentially economic growth that is essentially pitted human beings against the planet. And this is not me speaking as some environmentalist or card-carrying member of Greenpeace. This is me talking as a business person, as a person who is bioengineer by training. So I'm not coming to you with a green card pass here. I'm talking to you about the realities. We have created in a world in which our economic models are essentially at war with this, with the planetary constraints, and as well as people. And the pandemic is a little warning. It's just a little warning about we have to retreat. We have to find a way to live within the limits of the constraints. And I do believe that technology can play a role in it. Unfortunately, most of the digital technologies in the world today, and most technologies, in fact, are being used for us to enable us to essentially push the barriers even further and essentially transgress in ways without any checks and balances. So let me come back to technology and give you an example of why we need to reshape the rules of global capitalism, and an example of it already happening. We all know that around the world, there's concerns now about how some of the big tech companies are behaving. In the United States, there's a conversation about whether Facebook and all of them had disrupted the elections, democracy, and all of those things. But yesterday, the Chinese government is essentially is the only government in the world has decided to take on the tech companies, their own tech giants, in ways that most other governments are fearful, because they've all bought into this notion that the tech companies are a net good, and we just must further enable them so that they can add to essentially our economic programs. The Chinese government yesterday essentially called gaming and all the tech companies that are involved in it is essentially spiritual opium, and said they are going to clamp down and shut this down because of the negative impact on children, not to mention adults as well. So they just said, we are going to do something about this. The global Western media, from Bloomberg to the CNBCs and the FT, all of those that we read because we're sort of the global elites, had the usual reaction, oh my God, the Chinese don't understand. Well, actually they do. The role of what the Chinese government is saying is, we want technology, but we do not want technology that is essentially socially destructive. And gaming, if you're a parent, you will know, is destructive. And I'm not even talking about pornography and all this other stuff, which make up the vast majority of traffic on the internet, bandwidth or whatever you call it. So whenever people tell me that the internet is the greatest thing ever invented, and we should think about and we should embrace it, I always remind them, if you have kids and they are 10 years old, if you think they are not watching pornography, my friend, you are dreaming. Now, who's going to control that? Only by reshaping the rules, having some controls. The controls on global capitalism. The rules of capitalism, as we understand it, and the ideological basis is essentially an Anglo-American sort of invention, pushed out by the business schools. Don't stop the innovators. They will create everything good and great. Well, sorry, it's not that simple. And there needs to be checks and balances. So that's on the tech side. So what I'd like to just basically get you to understand as well, given we live in Southeast Asia, is what is tech being used for and how do we need to reshape technology? Capitalism. If technology is essentially the big enabler of capitalism, then let's go back to what is the root of capitalism. And I wrote a book about 7 years ago, which I'm not seeking to publicize, but if anyone's interested, it's called Consumptionomics and Asia's role in reshaping consumption. The fundamental driver of capitalism as we know it is essentially consumption. I think we can all agree that. Stock markets go up, people feel good, jobs are created as long as the economy is essentially throbbing with people consuming more. We all know that. Whether it's Hari Raya, Chinese New Year, or Christmas, when people are out there, they are buying, the economy is vibrant, whether it's being money is pumped into the system, whatever, companies thrive, everyone's feeling good. The problem with that, though, is that consumption is essentially the Achilles heel of the capitalist system. So let me just cut it down. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. But Asia's population today is about 4.5 billion people. The world's population will peak at about 10 billion in about 2060. Asia's population by that time will be about 6 billion people. The ASEAN population only will be about 1 billion people. India and China together will have a population of just over 3 billion. 6 billion Asians aspiring to live like Americans and Europeans through a consumption-driven capitalism model is essentially impossible. It's against the laws of physics, entropy, and everything else. I can give you many examples, but I think smart people here know what I'm talking. I'll just give you one example to drive the point home. If Asians eat as much meat as the average Americans and chickens, I have numbers in the book, essentially there'll be so many chickens in the world that we will essentially completely upturn the entire ecosystem of the planet. This is simply not possible. The numbers of chickens that Americans eat compared to the number of chickens Asians eat will essentially, if we aspire to that, we will essentially destroy the world, because there will be essentially industrial engineering on the scale to produce farm meat that is not possible. I'll give you one more example. If Asians, as we get richer, what do we aspire to? We aspire to eat seafood. You all know this. If 6 billion Asians eat seafood taken for granted in quantities taken for granted in Australia, Europe, or in the USA, the oceans will be empty, period. But who's to say that these Chinese people can't eat fish when the Australians can, or the New Zealanders can? That we are going to have to either do something to constrain and manage those, or we're going to essentially say the markets will work. Well, the markets don't work. And coming back to technology and using fisheries as an example of my argument, that far too much of our most advanced technologies are not used to essentially combat what the science is telling us about essentially the constraints. The evidence is so clear everywhere you look. But in fact, the technological advances we use are essentially used to continue to enable us to extract more. So coming back to my fisheries example, if you have any interest, please go and look it up. But most of the large fisheries in the world have been overfished. The South China Sea, etc., is being overfished. Most of us Asians have started to, if you're middle class and upper class living in Bangsa, we go to the sashimi food stalls, etc., and eat our bluefin tuna. Well, we should all know that the bluefin tuna is essentially being driven into extinction. So today what we have, though, is technology that enables the most sophisticated fishing fleets in the world, radar, sonar, GPS, satellites, you name it, to track down the last bluefin tuna in the South Pacific Ocean so that you can have it in uptown KL or Singapore or Jakarta or Hong Kong and eat it within 24 hours at a reduced cost. That's what technology has done. The same technology that could be used to essentially protect the bluefin tuna is not used. So what I'm talking about is the global social contract of what we need when we talk about technology. So what I mean by reshaping capitalism in the context of technology is that the mainstream narrative, and this is particularly a Western narrative to which I'm sure most of my Asian friends will not feel offended when I say we are all subservient to. You know, if it came out of Harvard Business School, it must be right. If a professor from MIT said the world is flat and the robots will take over, we will say that is right. We need more robots in India where there's too many people. That must be right too. We are subservient to these narratives. And we are not thinking for ourselves. We do not have that leadership that essentially says, well, this doesn't fit for us. You know, driverless cars in Mumbai, yeah, the guys in MIT in a little village called Boston can imagine that future. But if you've ever been to Mumbai, you know that is not the future we want. Work from home. Oh, really? Human beings are not meant to essentially sit at home and work. They are actually meant to be social animals. All of these narratives we are subservient to, we do not question. So I believe that we need to essentially start reimagining the world. The best ideas, the innovations that will not come out of the United States, Silicon Valley, or out of Europe with respect to fixing our problems. Our problems will have to be fixed by people in our part of the world who first understand what is the challenge. What is the challenge for 6 billion people? Is the challenge for 6 billion people going to be imagined by us white-collar workers, professionals, thinking that our privileges need to be preserved and expanded? Or are we going to understand because of the pandemic that something else going on? And therefore, how do we actually fix those problems? So we should sort of disabuse ourselves that the solutions are essentially in just free market capitalism, in greater democracy in this sort of very simplistic way. It is tied to business interests and technology, the democratization of everything, and technology as a panacea. This is not possible. To give another example of that, we need to reshape. Most of the cities in Asia, and I say this all the time with due respect to all the people in different cities, most of our large cities are dumps. If you're wealthy, you don't want to go and live there. Not to offend anyone, I won't name any cities, but most of them are dumps, in which middle class, upper class people find their little enclaves in which they live in luxury, whilst essentially externalizing the impacts of their lifestyles on everybody else, be it traffic, be it waste, air conditioning, water usage, all of those things. So we will have to essentially think about the way we reshape, even the way we urbanize, as not a panacea, but to actually think about the urbanization efficiency equation in a very different way. So with the pandemic, let me just say, what have we learned? What we've learned is, and I don't have time to get into the details, that the ability of the human being to essentially discard the limits in terms of the frontiers of the human sort of contact with the natural world has essentially come back to haunt us. Whether it came out from a lab in San Francisco, Wuhan, or Mumbai, or Kuala Lumpur, the reality is that it is essentially from the natural world. And then the inability, whether then people essentially experimented with it to create the mutant strains, etc., that was supposed to be innovation and research, no constraints. And no restrictions on essentially applying human know-how to play with nature. So if you want to know more, I'm happy to send some articles. But essentially, the pandemic is, if you want to put it crudely, the revenge of nature on us. And it came from animals, mainly bats, etc. What's the larger, where do we have the richest tropical biodiversity in the world? Malaysia, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia. We are the reservoir of many of these animals. They should be left alone. They should be left alone. Instead, what do? In the pursuit of a very shallow definition of prosperity, we continue to destroy without any restrictions. And for those of you who are interested, I've written quite a few pieces about this, about how we have infringed on essentially the natural systems in ways that we don't even understand the implications of. And in terms of the export of wildlife to the rest of the world, including China, the largest exporting region is Southeast Asia. So now how can we use technology to stop all of this? But fundamentally, the question is, what future do we want? What future do we want? There is a simple notion of neoliberal economics, which is essentially just grow the economic pie. At the moment, that pie is being grown by digital technology as the big enabler. Somehow the future will be better if we can all buy things quicker, faster, cheaper, and increase our convenience. That seems to be the big thing, the gig economy and all of that. It can get things cheaper, we can get it quicker, and it'll be bigger. And my God, I don't even have to get off my sofa because someone will deliver it to me. And it might be a drone or it might be a human being. That is really not the future we're looking for. The future has to be described in a very different way by essentially taking the science and the physics into account. 6 billion people, how are we going to essentially live? We're not going to be able to live by essentially continuing to extract. We're not going to continue to be able to live equitably by having an economic model which is driven simply by consumption. Now, what I mean by that consumption is I like you to think of this one thing. When we think about driving the economy and the engine of global capitalism is to essentially, if I can put it crudely, get you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have. Right. So to get you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have. So that's called our economic model of consumption. We constantly urge people to spend. It's called the credit card, etc. But when people buy so much, essentially, the impetus for buying so much is essentially price. You all know this. And how do we do that? The producers of goods and services essentially underprice the resources needed to produce those things and then externalize the true cost. So the economics of externalities is essentially the biggest well-kept secret in global capitalism. So the externalities of carbon dioxide is one thing that we're discussing at a global level, but most of Southeast Asia, we have not even taken the baby steps with regard to pricing carbon. And I don't even want to talk about how we don't price water, we don't price biodiversity, we don't price natural capital. So the capitalist economy that we now know of, we thrive on now, is essentially one that is extractive, it's exceptional, and it externalizes true costs. That's the only way when we go into a supermarket, they have that famous thing called buy one and get one free. How on earth did people get to do this, to buy one and get one free? The cost is completely externalized. So it's the carbon dioxide, it's water, it's the pollution, it's the plastics, and all of those things. That model of consumption-driven capitalism, which externalizes all the costs, cannot be sustained. And in the Asia-Pacific region, the middle class and those of us who have been lucky enough to enter into that sort of consumption model, consumption class, we're the minority. I mean, we are still, if I take the population of Asia today at about 4.5 billion, the consuming classes are less than 1 billion, as people like you and me. And we are taking a free ride. I'm not even talking about the Americans because that's like a different planet. But even on us, we are essentially consuming as a free ride by externalizing the true cost. We are free riders essentially on the natural systems. So now, having pointed that out to you, what can we do? And how can we do that with technology? So I'll come back to technology. The first thing you need, though, is you need good policies. You need good policies for good technology and tech to be directed towards solving society's needs. I've outlined very quickly, and I don't have enough time in a 40-minute session to talk about the existential threats of our time. But just imagine, just think about these things. Food, safe and secure food systems are going to be a major constraint on all of us. Most of us, though, think that as long as I earn money, I can go to a supermarket and buy the food. Well, think again. So that's going to be something we're going to think about. What has the pandemic taught us? The pandemic has taught us that if there's one thing we need to do in all the Asian countries and all around the world, is essentially invest in food security and therefore self-sufficiency. So if I look at my own country, Malaysia, we're not even self-sufficient in rice, and we all like to eat sambal and chili. We're not even self-sufficient in chili, because we thought there's some grand global deal on chilies that we don't have to grow ours and will come from somewhere else, right? But chili is not a food, it's just a condiment that you can use. But all the foods that we need in Malaysia, I would argue we could grow, yet we are importing. Now, then you might say, well, what's technology got to do with it? Hell of a lot. So we could completely redesign our land use systems to essentially look at how we produce all the essential foods so that the country becomes self-sufficient, using an array of technologies. And I don't need to explain to the tech people here, from drones to how to use water supply to detect groundwater levels, right through to planting systems, harvesting. You can do a whole lot. In certain countries, they're already doing it. I have some experience in China. I travel a lot in rural China, in poor areas of China, in semi-desert areas like Gansu, etc. And they're using the most advanced technologies to remap the entire edifice of the rural ecosystems to essentially replenish it. And I've in fact had the privilege of meeting and talking to the CEO of one of the leading tech companies in China that's doing it. He's only about 35 years old. And the Chinese government has employed his country to start to map out all the stressed out ecosystems in the country so that they can essentially get big data flowing and understand how to use the land and employ people. The ultimate job is to employ people. So rather than us talking about technology as some sort of magical industry in which kids can all become software engineers, we should be actually talking about how do we apply the technology we already have to address the main problems of our countries, one of which is food supply. So imagine a 20-year-old student from a small town in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, who doesn't feel that obligation that they must go to Kuala Lumpur to get a job, because we have now built a completely different distribution system using technology to provide and address the issue of food self-sufficiency, which is going to be so important. And then you need to have competent leaders. And I want to talk about this, competent leaders at the government level, at the technical level, good people like the ones in MDEC, etc. Giving you guys a shout out here, who essentially hire the best people, but who are guided by a vision set by policymakers to say, so what are we trying to do? Are we trying to solve the food problem? Yes. In which case, what are the enabling policies? That filters down through education, training, etc. We don't need just simply more software engineers. We need a whole host of other people who are then growing the food, but who are able to essentially access the best technology, the data, etc., in a rural area, in Kelantan or in Jogja or somewhere like that, to essentially plan. Then you need policies that essentially enable the fruits of their labor, the pricing of ecosystem services, to essentially be priced into the consumption model, which I've talked about it already. So that the consumption model of pricing food, particularly, is done in a way that is equitable to the farmer, therefore continues to enrich the rural areas, allows for investments in there, and then allows the consumers to pay a fair price and not overconsume. I mean, we all seen an explosion of obesity. I think Malaysia is Southeast Asia's champion, isn't it, at obesity? And the direct correlation is, I'm not trying to essentially have a go at the palm oil industry. The palm oil industry is important, but we can do this much more efficiently, and therefore not underprice it in a way that it has a huge amount of impact on ecosystems, as well as on the social costs of essentially fried food, because that's the only sort of available food for poorer people, etc. So you start pricing the entire ecosystem. That's what we need to do. Another area where technology should be used, and I'll use the example of Klang Valley. Over the last year, I think all the residents of KL have found they've been disrupted with water supply cuts repeatedly over the 3 months. Here is a city that is blessed with natural environment in which water should never be a problem. You know, we're not in the sort of border areas of the Sahara Desert or somewhere in Australia. We're in the tropics. And we have essentially had all of this because of complete mismanagement of the natural systems, the resource systems. Imagine a technology setup where we are able to track all incursions into water catchment areas in real time. We are able to essentially detect water flows through the entire ecosystem that is essentially provided to the appropriate ministries, etc., in real time. And then we're able to price water consumption in ways, because what we have now is essentially still a 1920s mechanism where people can go and essentially dump waste in the catchment areas. Things can be disrupted in ways that affect millions of people, and productivity losses. That's where technology should be used. And if anyone's interested, you know, I'm very happy to talk about how we would do this. At the same time, there's education. And one area of education that I've often thought was very important is to make the children of countries in the Asia region as stewards of essentially the natural world, and at the same time get them interested in science and technology using their mobile phone. And I'll just give you one example to excite everybody. Most of the literature on the exotic animals and butterflies and dragonflies and beetles of Southeast Asia, which is the richest in the world, are not written by Southeast Asians. We don't do this. But imagine we don't even have the proper data. But imagine that if we could essentially create a cloud system through all the schools throughout the country, where we energize children through their mobile phones to essentially start taking pictures of all the things that they observe, including infringements, etc. We have real-time data that we can use to monitor. The students become, the young people become the stewards. They become students at the same time. They begin to get interested in biology, the flora and fauna, chemistry, and all of those things. And you create an amazing repository of scientific data over 10 years. That's what big data should be for. That's what the cloud should be for. Over 10 years, imagine the amount of students who collect all that data and the research that would essentially come out of it. I'm not even going to talk about the array of trees in tropical Asia that are not properly accounted for, not properly known, and people in Southeast Asia don't even know about. And all of that could be essentially combined. You know, instead we go to Kew Gardens in Richmond in London to look at the genome collection of all of these things. We should have it at home, right? So those are kind of things I believe we can do. So let me just say that in my last 5 minutes, we need to understand that the reshaping of the rules of global capitalism targets the negative externalities. And I gave you an example of the Chinese government saying there's a negative externality, which is too costly, of essentially allowing unfettered access to gaming through devices, and they're going to clamp down. I talked about porn, which is a different subject, but I know when the Chinese government clamps on it, it's called in the Western media censorship. But I know if Google wants to do it, it's called an algorithm, right? You could do it. So business models need to change. That's the point I'm trying to make about externalities. Then on the natural systems, I talked about we cannot go on with a system of essentially consumption that is at war with natural systems. We can't. Technology can play an incredibly important role here. And I urge all the tech company people to sort of free themselves, liberate themselves from another app and devising another app that enables people to date with strangers, sugar daddies, that enables them to buy things on the cheap using slave labor. It's called your Grab driver, by the way, who's not paid properly. How come that stuff's so cheap, right? No social protections, etc. So much of the gig economy, in my view, is kind of modern day slavery. I said it here, okay? How are we going to change that? What problems are we trying to solve? So if you are really a tech innovator, before you go and do some business model innovations in terms of selling more junk to people who don't need stuff, I've said this before, and I've written a piece saying that Singles Day, Jack Ma's great invention, is probably the worst thing of the Chinese civilization ever. That it's probably the worst thing ever invented by Chinese. And I think most Chinese people know buying junk they don't need with money they don't have, most of that is wasted. And the externalities of that is not essentially paid for by Alibaba or Jack Ma. And I know Chinese policymakers who are going to get onto that one, the wastage of all of that. Who pays for all the junk, all that wrapping? So if you look at business models too, and again, to all the entrepreneurs here, the Amazon now, I would just want to talk about Amazon and Apple because they are seen as the gods and the behemoths of the tech world. The Amazon business model is essentially based on externalizing true costs, the best example. Why is something cheap on Amazon? Because the worker is screwed, and I mean exploited. The worker is exploited in large warehouses. We all know this. Using technology, and essentially the entire supply chain exploits the externalities. And in the US, and I think in different parts of the world, the Amazon business model allows you to look at a pair of slippers, pick 3, order them, they get delivered. You can then try one and send the 2 back, all for half the price of what you buy in a store. Tell me, my friends, where do you think the real cost of that is? Where is the cost? They don't pay for it. We pay for it as a society. The plastics, the carbon footprint, all of that junk. And then let's look at Apple, the phone, finally. The phone is essentially the most advanced technological device that human beings have ever invented. But his entire business model is premised on essentially wastage. And I don't even want to talk about what's the true price of this, but it underprices everything. But the entire premise is, if I look at my childhood, when my parents and my uncles or aunties or friends, they went to buy a rice cooker in 1970. They looked at the rice cooker because it seemed like something from Mars, came from Japan, called Toshiba. And they thought, if I buy this, will it last for 500 years? And can we send it down the family, right? You bought a car hoping it would last 100 years. Well, now you got the most advanced company in the world designing something with the most advanced technology designed to die on you, and then taking no responsibility for essentially take-back schemes. That is essentially an economic system that needs to change. And I believe that sometime in the not too distant future, governments will start to say, you make that device, and if you make it die and design it to die on people, we will make you take it back. So in conclusion, I would like to just say in Southeast Asia, what do we want to do with all this advanced technology? Do we simply think that urban middle class are entitled to essentially, Netflix on demand? That poor kids in a small village who don't have proper toilet education will have a mobile device and they can watch Netflix on demand and pornography and streaming? Or do we think that we are going to essentially use the most advanced technology to essentially address the existential threats of our time and essentially change that? That requires another level of disruptive thinking that most people are reluctant to. The great disruptors of tech do not want to be disrupted in terms of their ideological obsessions. And therein lies finally the question of institutions. And in the Malaysian context this week, I wrote a piece saying, we know the political mess in the country, but I said fundamentally, we need to have competent people in policy making. To do the sort of things that I've rushed through in the last 40 minutes, needs essentially a system of competence. We need technocrats to really understand, but not simply understand technology for technology's sake, but understand what are the value systems that guide the use of our technology. What are we looking to achieve in our society? And not simply talk about tech for good as some slogan. We all know these companies are looking for. So we need vision. And I really call for the governments in the region to not ape the latest thing from Harvard Business School, MIT, all those purveyors of tech fantasies, but to look at our world and look at what's going on. I can take you just an hour away from the Twin Towers of Kuala Lumpur, and we all talk about IR 4.0, Industrial Revolution 4.0, And I can take you 1 hour away from almost any capital in Southeast Asia, and sometimes not even an hour away, and show you not industrial revolution, but pre-industrial practices on an industrial scale. 1 hour away. While the elites like us continue to, gather at conferences like this, shoot the breeze, drink the Kool-Aid, and forget what's going on. My call to you as a disruptor, and I hope no one's hating me by now, is to say, my friends, you got to have the capability in terms of thinking about this. Think about what's happening in the next 30 years. The pandemic should have given you food for thought. Right now, we need to build capacity and leadership. And I can only speak for my own country. We need technocrats who understand. We need competency. And we need to attract the best people into the best roles to create the enabling policies so that the technologists, the innovators like you, hopefully, having opened your mind up to what the world looks like, will try and solve real problems rather than take a free ride on the very, very, what can I say, abusive system of global capitalism we have at the moment, which is unsustainable. So Raymond, let me stop there, and happy to take some questions. I could speak for another hour, but I think I should shut up now and take some questions. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that. That was mind-blowing, really. That was such an engaging session for me, and I'm sure the viewers. There have been quite a number of questions coming in, but I thought I really want to start with, say, this is interesting, right? Because when the internet came out, we looked at it as the great connector, right? So it started about, we want to explore, we want to connect. We couldn't go across borders, and the internet gave us that access, and catalyzed, cross-border thoughts, thinking, collaborations. But recently, it seemed to be that it's mostly for consumption of pornography, consumption of gaming content, consumption of e-commerce sort of things, right? So it seems that the tech right now is geared towards making things, like you said, cheaper, more convenient, easier, but leading towards greed. Greed as in I need to grab as much as I can from this, right? So that in itself shows that is tech really sustainable? And because we look at tech, right? We say that, listen, we need the next AI, machine learning, big data, but to what end?
Yes.
Are we going down a rabbit hole here by saying, let's reinvent, or let's go to machine learning where we really need more human learning, for example, in India, like you rightly pointed out, right? So to that point, I got a question here to say that, what is your advice to introduce specific technology subjects to begin at schools and to teach them the fundamentals before they head off to university into the working life? What are some of the core basic blocks? If we talk about, STIE and so forth, right? What's your view on that?
Well, there is always a well-established curriculum, and that's a large topic. But every kid has a right to understand the basic sciences, history, geography, all of that. Those should be taught. But when we talk about technology, and I'm doing some work here in Hong Kong as well, in terms of tech talent, etc., there's a huge amount of confusion about what that actually kind of means, right? There is one definition of tech talent, which is essentially about elites going to the best schools, going to foreign universities and coming back and then speaking mumbo jumbo from Silicon Valley, right? And then there's a whole host of other things, which are essentially people who could do other things, which do not involve reinventing something. So my answer to your question is, we need to teach values. And I don't mean this in some spiritual, abstract way. It's essentially taking what I talked about now and breaking it down for the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old, the 12-year-old. What sort of world do we want to be in? What problems do you see? And how can you, in your career aspirations, look to contribute to solving that problem? And there's a lot of people, young people, particularly coming from middle-class families, et cetera, and millennials, whatever they are, who also woke and they want to save the world. But they actually are just tinkering at the edges, right? So we need to teach across the board, what is it the world's going to look like, what the constraints are, and what this is going to look like, at different age groups. And to that point, I just wanted to mention something, Raymond. So, what I'm talking about, I've condensed into 40 minutes, is essentially a whole curriculum of different things we teach at the Global Institute. And we've been doing this for 10 years. And so now I've decided this is the time to take it onto an e-learning platform for a global level. We're actually starting that company in Malaysia, right, to be the first in the world. It's and you can see from the little I've said, what I've talked about, they don't teach you at business schools because it's ideologically opposed to the business school narrative. But this is what the real science is teaching us, and we're putting it in narrative in the Asian context. So we're building out this whole e-learning platform. If there are any investors there, I'm shamelessly pitching, but we're going to set it up in Malaysia because I think Malaysia has some fundamental strengths, despite our inability to tell the right stories. Right. We get a lot of bad press because of the horrible politics, but we got a lot of talent. And the talent is not about the way we simply look at it. And I've interviewed several people to be the CEO, etc. But that's what we're going to do, to take it down, and then eventually to take that content and break it down for a lower level too. So that it goes to the schools. And we're the only ones who are doing that, because most of the other stuff is still the standard. You can go and be a tech entrepreneur. And I'm constantly asked, Chandran, how can we have more tech entrepreneurs? I said, don't focus on that. Focus on essentially education that builds and creates responsible citizens. Responsible citizens who understand their values, their contribution, then depending on their aptitude, will go and find pathways to apply their interests and their value systems, because everything is out there for learning. But you have to first create responsible citizens, and you have to give each one of them a chance. And that's where systems, in our country at least, are a bit broken at the moment, and I hope we can fix it.
So before we go to one of the 3 points that you brought up, there's another question here, and I thought it's quite pertinent to put it in here. How can a social startup enterprise get support from an organization such as GIFT? Because healthy land is for healthy families, which then gives us a chance for healthy children, right? So renew, regrow, and simplify our existence, right? So the question is, what is that one step you would ask to be implemented for consumers, or for consumers to think about? What is that one step to do that? So 2 questions actually. How can a social startup enterprise get support? And secondly is, what is the one step you ask consumers to look at?
Thank you. So I've done, what some of the things we do with our leadership programs is we essentially take a social enterprise that is struggling somewhere and wants to essentially scale up. I mean, I like the word of social enterprise. It's all very hip, but most of them are run by people who have good intentions, but have no business skills. So first you need to understand, do you have some business skills, right? So there's too much of this sort of love fest around social enterprise. But so the first thing I can do for you, whoever that person is, do write to me. I will dissect your enterprise and tell you if you are smoking dope or whether it's going to save the world or do something. Now I'm going to dissect your business model and say, yes, you got something here, and here are some investors you can look at. So the first thing is you need to get some good advice, not from your social investment friends, but some people who really understand what it is, and not your typical investors. So that's the first thing. We don't bring money to the table, but I can certainly help put you in touch with investors. And some of those investors are people like you. So, I think in a future year, for instance, in next year, maybe, Raymond, you guys could have a 2-hour session where you're essentially showcasing 3 great ideas of social enterprise. And not some of this, let's do another app to deliver some vegetarian, vegan food. That stuff is all old. We all done that. If someone's got a really good idea, and you can have, I'm happy to do the scrutiny for you. But get people to really understand. You got to scale up. What does that look like? So that's one thing we can help, and that's a larger conversation. But in terms of simple actions that people do, of course, all of us have different lifestyles and preferences, but do think about the externalities component of what your day-to-day activities are. Most of us living in urban cities cannot escape the trap. We are caught. You can't go to the supermarket these days and come away without a plastics. I struggle. So then there are other decisions you can start to make, which I think are very important about the way we use electricity, etc., water, and all of those things. There too, my view is electricity, water must be essentially priced. And I think a modern smart city, everyone talks about that, should essentially have, using the Internet of Things, start pricing things. So I've spoken at the World Tourism Conference last 2 years ago in Spain, and everyone was talking about, oh, we need to do something, but no one had specifics. So I said, all hotels in the world could essentially say, we will set the temperature at a certain level. Right? So if you come to Malaysia from Europe, and you like Malaysia, but you want to sleep at 20 degrees C because that's the temperature you're used to, well, the ambient temperature we will set in the room is 24. If you want to sleep at 23, you have a right, but my God, we will charge you, called the Internet of Things. Right? We'll charge you for every hour. So that's pricing mechanisms. The other thing people talk about is water. So I said to all the CEOs of the big companies, why don't you get rid of the bathtubs in all your luxury hotels, have a shower. It's called the 3-minute shower. And as soon as someone showers for more than 3 minutes, we'll charge you, called the Internet of Things. So you see, I'm giving all your tech guys a lot of great examples of how you can essentially use technology to essentially help really monitor things, get the data, and price it in. And we can talk about food too. So that's the individual actions are difficult because they're just kind of preaching that I'm a bit better than you. But what is needed is essentially policies that enforce us to do things. So for instance, in KL, we should be using technology to now essentially put in road pricing right across the Klang Valley. What's stopping us? Right? What's stopping us? So charging schemes, Singapore's got it. Then you have to also invest in public transport, and you all know how that works. But we believe that an individual has a right to 3 cars. They can drive anywhere, and my God, we must do politically whatever we can to keep the price of gasoline down. Well, that's the pathway to doom. So you're going to need to essentially say, hey, my friends, you can have 1 car. If you have 2, we will charge you so exorbitantly, you will think twice. And then when you drive into certain areas, we're going to charge you. And by the way, there'll be no parking. And then we free up the space.
So going back to this, so this is good policies crafted, developed, implemented by competent leaders.
Yes.
And so that's really important because
competence is key. If you don't have competent leaders and you have all the half-baked kind of people that we have in our government, political appointees, well, you will never have good policies. I'm sorry. And Singapore is a great example of technocrats running essentially a city-state. And for those who are interested, China is run by technocrats.
Right. So, when we talk about the good policies there, and you mentioned social enterprises being, a word maybe that's been overused perhaps. There's also ESG that's come up now quite a lot, and a lot of companies are looking to ESG investing in all of that, right? But the reality is this. ASEAN, like I said, is now about 680 million, depending on who you ask, 700 million, going up to 1 billion, as you rightly pointed out, in the next decade or so. That will require consumption. I mean, it's when you look at the Pavlovian theory, right? You would have to move. I mean, that's what people want, right? It's not just food, fresh air, and whatever. It will require.
Precisely. So that's my point. Again, I don't want to advertise, but that's the point of my second book. So my second book argues all this ESG stuff coming out of Europe and US, applying to large multinationals is kind of okay. It's a little financial play. It's an asset class. It doesn't solve the problem of 1 billion ASEAN people or 1.5 billion Indians, of whom 600 million do not have a proper home, right? So you're absolutely right. So in my second book, I argue those needs are basic human rights. The need for food, safe and secure. Water and sanitation. That would be the biggest infrastructure project in the world. What has the pandemic taught us? Wash your hands. Where does all that water go for? Most people do not have safe drinking water in the world. I would argue even in the Klang Valley that 60 to 70% of our waste is not treated. And I would like the Bandaraya to prove me wrong. But if you were to treat all of that, you create tens of thousands of jobs, you turn around the entire ecosystem, But to do all of those for those people who are disenfranchised, I said our population is about 4.5 billion now. We'll reach 6 billion. Let's assume by 2060, 2 billion of those are in the consuming classes. We got 4 billion who are unattended. Their needs have to be met. Food, safe and secure, water, sanitation, basic housing, electricity, education. They will need to consume. Their consumption will essentially drive the world in another level. So whatever happens with ESG in Zurich, New York, doesn't matter. What happens is, how will we in Asia and Africa, 2 billion people, essentially allow the majorities who have not in the consumption orbit yet to live a decent life, not a life of overconsumption. You and I, and I think I'm not a bad guy, but we are all living lives of luxury and privilege and overconsumption already. All right, we're already doing that. And I think I try and be better than most. So we're already over. The Americans and Europeans are out here. They're going to have to essentially come down. This will be very difficult. So their political systems will not allow them to essentially change. They will not, because everyone's free. We're going to have to do something different. And therefore, the Asia Pacific and Africa will change the world. Change the world either in terms of taking us down a very dire, dark path if we follow the Western economic model of essentially unfettered consumption and urge everyone to consume as the only means of essentially enabling the economy to survive around the misplaced metrics that are currently used. Or we say there's something called a moderate prosperity. A moderate prosperity is one in which the 600 million Indians who don't have a home, a toilet and water supply, and they don't have a barbecue pit, a lawn, and a swimming pool. And even if you are wealthy in the Klang Valley, you are not entitled to a private swimming pool because water will be costly. So all of these things start to play in. And, I've talked about California will completely need to rethink because how they live, because it's become the hottest place in the planet. And all their software engineering is not going to help them because, nature's coming after them. So they're going to have policies that essentially restrict even wealthy people from having access to certain parts of essentially the Californian rural hinterland, which is essentially prone to fire risk. So then there's a rights issue coming in.
I'm going to jump in because I'm mindful of time as well. There are two things I want to bring up. And the first thing is, when people talk about tech, generally, they say that, government light touch, let them regulate themselves. They know what to do. They're the most innovative people. So the tech, no, leave it to us. We know what to do. Just provide us with a framework and we go, right?
Yes.
But then to the end, when they are doing that, most of it is again going back towards I'm being driven by profits, right? I need to create jobs, so I'm going to look at consumption more than anything else. Well, obviously there are other areas as well, and we know this, that they're looking to water, sanitation, and all of those. So then the question is there a litmus test for a new approach or business model being driven towards the right direction?
Well, when you say most people, I was going to just say, you mean the American business schools. So that's the virus that spread around the world, light touch, all that. Actually, is not embedded in any literature beyond the business schools fabricating that 30 years ago and then spreading around the world. It's not in the, it's not in the holy books, and it's not a law of physics, right? So it's ideology. It's ideology, right? And they are having that ideological battle in the US. We should not get corrupted by these things. My point in my second book is there is no substitute for essentially rules if you believe, like I do, the 21st century with 10 billion people is going to be the most challenging period for human civilization. We, in this time and the next generation, are living through the exponential rise of the human population. Never happened before. So even if you look at India's population, quadrupled in 50 years, in 70 years. Thousands of years of civilization. So we're going to have to rewrite, and we should not be looking to the United States and all those little sort of upstarts for ideas. We're going to have to think about it. So light touch or what I call is the right touch, right? Free enterprise is needed, but there's no free ride. And only the state can protect you and me from each other and essentially protect public goods. Microsoft doesn't do it, nor does Nike or McDonald's. The public good and common interest is not the domain of private interest. It's the rule of the state. Therefore, comes back to the point. So what does the state look like? It has to be led by competent people who are driven by the science, the data, good decision-making, and not distracted by their own rent-seeking sort of interest. That is what we will need. So that's the point I'm going to make. We should really disabuse ourselves of this business school narratives that said, we don't need the government. We need the government, but we need to demand the government is competent, technocrats. And then, of course, we need checks and balances, but we cannot have a free ride.
Two more questions, very quick one. You said earlier on that the gig economy could be taken as a form of modern slavery, right? Where it's not priced in. But then again, I've got a question here to say that listen, it's also our choice. We don't want to be shackled by this modern workspace reporting to people who set those rules, right? So it's my choice, and yes, I don't enjoy all the benefits of pension or retirement, but I work at my own leisure and I earn what I want to earn. What's your comeback to that?
Yeah, so that person's probably middle class, white collar, gig worker. Good for you, but you're the minority. The person I'm talking to is go to Bangsa or go to anywhere in Southeast Asian cities and look at all of those poor guys delivering your food. Even in Hong Kong, I know those guys because some of them I play hockey, good Malaysian, and some of my hockey guys are street guys, right? And it's completely exploitated. But when I was in KL for the last until April, I was watching all the time. And I went and talked to all of those guys. Slave labor. But you don't need to be a genius to know how come their stuff is so cheap, right? You used to buy that nasi lemak or that fried vegetables or whatever for 3 ringgit. And now there's someone delivering it to you for less. How does that work? What's the carbon footprint of the transport, etc.? And if you go and talk to those guys, they have no choice. That's my point. They have no choice. The majority of these delivery people have no choice. They have to work. But we should pay. And that's where policy is. So the Grabs or whatever should have regulation imposed by the government on minimum wages for all their delivery workers. Then we will see how the pricing changes, etc. Yeah. So my point about all of this is pricing and good government policies. And but there's no substitute for that. So, if you don't pay properly, then people who have the privilege of consuming will exploit the system. And that's why I call it slave labor. I'm not talking to white collar workers who have the privilege, but those who don't. I mean, I advise any one of you, just go and spend an hour looking at how these guys work and what they get paid.
Happy to report the Malaysian government is looking into the plight of the gig economy and the workers and looking at
very good.
MDEC is obviously in conversations with the government as well. Studies coming up. So happy to report that on that note. The second one is the last question perhaps is extract against replenish.
Yes.
Right. So right now tech is being looked at more towards
extraction
rather than replenish.
Replenish or to in fact protect.
Yes.
Right.
What are some of the views in terms of thinking that perhaps we should start with our tech guys who we say start with a problem statement?
Yes.
Right? How are you going to monetize?
Well, first, I think, and I do this again in our leadership programs. I'm very pleased to say we're working with some of Malaysia's leading companies with their young talent, not just tech, but their future executives, with this exact narrative. I am as honest as I have been with this audience. So how do we price? What is your business model? How is it extracted? Where's the role of technology? So the first thing is to say, which problem are we trying to solve? Is it essentially value-based? Is it socially constructive? If you want to solve a problem about, more people need to have more dates, well, I'm not interested. Okay, you go and do that with the Harvard Business School guy. Okay, but if you're interested in looking, how do we improve food production in Malaysia on staples without essentially opening up new farmland? How do we start to use denuded, abandoned land in Malaysia? And there's a lot of it. How do we map that over the next year so that we increase food production, water use, conservation of land, etc.? Then you say, I want to solve that problem. Right? Values. Then the second question is, what is the business model? I come from a business background. Then we go and work out, well, who are the buyers of this service that I can provide? So I've worked with a couple of companies in Malaysia, and we said, hey, maybe the Malaysian government would be a buyer of your data if you come up with this kind of information. Maybe farmers would be, maybe Felda, maybe Felcra, all of these large conglomerates. First thing is, which problem are you trying to solve? If you're driven as a young entrepreneur to get people to essentially have pizzas delivered to them by robots and drones, well, you go ahead. But I would like to ask you, what is your purpose? What's the value of all the education? But if you're interested in something else, and then you want to look at it, there's a field of opportunities. So I think you start by, what problem am I trying to solve? Are they enabling policies for the government in terms of both economic policies, investments, etc.? Then the next question, and that's where the brain starts to work. That's where the innovation is. What's your business model? How are you going to monetize it? And you don't have a right to be a millionaire, just because you came up with a good idea. That's not a human right. I'm going to
bring it down. I'm going to bring it down to some people may disagree, but I'm going to bring it down.
No, you don't have a right. You're making money is a social construct. It's a social construct. And quite often that social construct is skewed to essentially benefit a few people.
I think some of the words have been thrown out, which we firmly believe as well as shared prosperity. I think that there has to be a equalizer, and we say that digital is a great equalizer. But again, to what end are we using tech for? Is something to be answered. Just to bring it back to the end. Firstly, let me congratulate you on that announcement that you're starting an EdTech investment opportunity in Malaysia. We welcome you back, Chandran, and good luck with that. MDEC is here to support.
Thank you.
Our Future 5 strategy is also clean tech and edutech.
Thank you.
We have released a statement on that. So let's we look forward to that. And I think more importantly is how we want our guys to open their mind to look at replenish rather than extract.
That's
not
right.
Tech for good, but tech for sustainability, because there is a market for that. You can still make your money. You can still work hard and make a difference, but not tech for good, because good for whom? Right? So tech more for sustainability, shared prosperity, I think is a key takeout from what I got from you. And finally, again, policies and institutions, technocrats, but then again, also for the private sector to be driving this in as much as the government needs to do policies. We also sometimes do self-destructive practices, in our pursuit for wealth, So on that note, I think this has been such an engaging session, Chandran. Not enough time. Not enough time, but I can say I just think our entrepreneurs need to ask this question. I rarely see, I go to a lot of these things, and I rarely see business leaders speak about this openly. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but sometimes you just need to start asking the right questions, and then we can work together to do this. So I thank you for the opportunity. I hope I haven't offended anybody, but there's a bit of disruption for you. Spoken from the heart, from fellow Malaysians. I think we've only got Malaysia's interest at heart, and how we look at it in a global perspective. Again, short notice. Thank you for accepting our invitation here. It's been a wonderful session, right? And I wish you the best in Hong Kong, and please do come back when you can.
I can't wait to get back. So I will be. I mean, I'm back and forth all the time, but now I'm stuck here. But Malaysia is home.
Take care and have a good day ahead. Thank you, audience.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Back to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Definitely not enough time. Thank you for that mind-provoking session. Thank you, Chandran, for your thoughts, and Siva on moderating that lively Q&A. Okay, fantastic discussion. Thank you. We'll now be moving forward to our next session of the day. It will begin shortly, so click join session and also complete this survey for each of the sessions as we strive to continuously serve you better. Okay, see you a bit later.